I always start this lecture on reproductive biology with this photograph of a passion flower, Passiflora incarnata. It's a cold hardy passion flower that's native to Florida. It's not a tree, it's a vine, but gosh, it's a really pretty flower, and it really shows the reproductive structures, the pistils and stamens, typical of an angiosperm flower. So I just always like to start with that. But want to first go through the stages of reproductive growth that are common both to angiosperms and gymnosperms, and then we'll drill down a little bit and talk separately about angiosperms and gymnosperms after that. But the first stage of reproductive growth is initiation of floral primordia. This is a micrograph of a loblolly pine bud. Just to remind you of what a bud cross-section looks like, we can actually see in here some of the leaf primordia. These are needle primordia being formed. But just a reminder that reproductive structures also exist as primordia in buds. So that's the first stage of reproductive growth, is the initiation of those embryonic reproductive structures in buds that typically overwinter. The next is the emergence of reproductive structures from those buds, usually in the spring, in the year following the fall in which those primordia are initiated. This is obviously a pine, and this is shows the emergence of ovulate strobili, which I'll talk about in more detail later when I talk about conifers. So emergence of those reproductive structures, those might be true flowers in angiosperms or the male and female strobili in conifers, in pine. The next step in reproduction is pollination. Most temperate forest trees are wind pollinated, so their pollen is distributed from the trees by wind. Some trees are insect pollinated, so it's much more common in tropical trees, but also a fair number of fruit trees also are insect pollinated. But most temperate forest trees are wind pollinated, and I love this video from YouTube because it pretty graphically demonstrates wind pollination, and also I like the people's reactions to it. So let's watch that.
Has to be something with fertilization.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Oh, here it comes.
Oh my goodness.
Oh yeah, look at that.
Oh.
It's like it's on fire.
Well, you would think it would run out.
Well, certainly can't do that more than a day or two.
If we had a really hard downpour rain and wind.
That's great. I mean, and those people get it. They know that pine tree is distributing its pollen in the wind, and woman says you would think it would run out. That's an acknowledgement that there's a fair amount of carbon investment involved in reproduction. And so I think some really astute observations. At the end, the guy mentions rain. Certainly, rain can be an issue with pollination, and I'll mention that again in a minute. The next step in reproduction is fertilization. And I think a really important take-home here is that pollination and fertilization are separate events. So the arrival of pollen at the female reproductive structures is a discrete event that is separate from fertilization. So fertilization involves pollen tube growth, so that basically the pollen grain lands on the pistil, and that generates the growth of a pollen tube that grows down into the pistil to the ovary. And then the sperm cells migrate down the pollen tube, and the sperm cell fuses with the egg cell to produce the diploid zygote. So that's the formation of the zygote. And a second sperm cell fuses with polar nuclei to form endosperm. Endosperm is really important because that's essentially the food that the zygote uses as it's developing. Endosperm is also really important for humans because the cereal grains that we eat, we're eating endosperm. So endosperm is the source of calories for most of human civilization. So again, just remembering that those pollination and fertilization are separate steps in reproduction. Then the next step is growth and differentiation of the embryo within the seed, and then the growth of fruits and cones to maturity and ripening. And I always like to show off this picture of sugar pine cone taken in the Sierra Nevada. That's sort of an extreme example of big cone production in a pine. There certainly is variation in seed production in trees, in forest trees especially. The number of seed produced can vary enormously from year to year. So this is an example of cone production in white fir, documented over a period of several decades. What you can see is that basically years of high cone production vary with years of very low cone production. And there's lots of up and down. And that kind of behavior or pattern is often called masting pattern, which basically means irregular patterns where there are years with very high seed production and years with very low seed production. There also are species which are biennial bearers. So some species take 2 years to complete the reproductive cycle. So that sort of builds in variation in seed production. So at any rate, lots of variation in seed production in forest trees. And there can be lots of reasons for that. And those can include variations in pollination. So there may be years when there's low pollen production, or years when weather reduces the ability for wind pollination to happen. So rain events, for instance, obviously reduce the effectiveness of wind pollination, for instance. There can be breakdown in fertilization. So, for instance, pollen tube growth can be interrupted for various reasons, and fertilization might not occur. Environmental conditions. So I mentioned rain, unusual cold can slow or stop reproduction. Within plant, competition for resources. Reproduction, like I mentioned, is an expensive endeavor in terms of carbon. So if a plant has low carbon stores, it likely cannot reproduce in any particular year. In addition, predation or disease can impact reproduction. There are insects and fungi that sometimes impact different stages of the floral or seed development process. So there's any of a number of ways that things can go wrong. That's sort of summarized here. These are some neat data collected by John Owens, who is one of the experts on conifer reproductive biology. And here, John Owens' group looked at reproduction in western hemlock, Douglas fir, and western red cedar in particular years and documented, what fraction of seed produced were viable versus not viable, and why maybe they weren't viable. So, in this particular year, 70% of the seed produced by western hemlock were viable, and then the other 30% weren't viable for various reasons. Pollen, they weren't pollinated, the ovule aborted, and so on. But you can see, for instance, in western red cedar, only 7% of the seed produced were viable, and then there were various reasons that the seed were not viable. So the take home here is that reproduction is a multi-step process, and things can go wrong in any of those steps along the way and prevent a viable seed from being produced. So that's the take home there. Just a real going to give then a quick and dirty summary of reproductive biology in angiosperms. This is a typical angiosperm flower, and really, for the purposes here, I just want you to know that the pistil is the female reproductive structure, and the stamen is the male reproductive structure. And in this case, those both occur in this particular flower. So this flower, because it contains both pistil and stamen, is a perfect flower. Okay, so a perfect flower contains both male and female reproductive structures. Obviously then it follows that an imperfect flower contains only male or only female reproductive parts in it. As well, we can have different distribution of reproductive parts on individuals. So in Monoecious species, male and female occur on one individual. So in monoecious species, individuals produce both male and female reproductive parts. I can remember that because monoecious means the Greek for that, or that's Greek for one house. So in monoecious species, there is one house. Male and female reproductive structures occur in one house. So then it follows that in dioecious species, male and female occur in different individuals. And then obviously dioecious means two houses. So reproduction occurs in two houses. Certainly the monoecious pattern is the most common. In most forest trees are monoecious. But there are some dioecious species. So especially for instance, in the willow family, Salicaceae, a number of species in Salicaceae, the willows and the cottonwoods, tend to be dioecious. Holly is dioecious. Another dioecious forest tree species that a lot of people are familiar with or have heard of is ginkgo. And ginkgo still is to some extent, but a number of decades ago, much more so, is a very popular street tree, planted as an ornamental. It tolerates urban conditions well. And typically, ginkgos used for ornamental purposes, they planted male trees. And that's because the fruit of ginkgo, shown here, some people say that it smells like rotting flesh. And that's clearly not a very desirable attribute for a street tree. So people tended to plant the males of ginkgos when they were planting street trees. I wanted to add one final clarification regarding the monoecious classification. I've looked at a number of botanical references, and there's some mixed opinions that I've read regarding exactly how you define monoecious. I think probably the majority of the references that I saw depart a little bit from the definition I gave on the previous slide in terms of a monoecious species being a species that contains male and female reproductive structures in separate flowers. So that definition would hold that monoecious species only have imperfect flowers, but both male and female imperfect flowers on the same individuals. And therefore, a species that has perfect flowers would be hermaphroditic. I tend to prefer just the monoecious definition that embraces both perfect or imperfect male and female structures on one individuals, but I just wanted to clarify that those differences in definition do exist out there. So regardless, most, at least temperate forest tree species are monoecious and or hermaphroditic. So talk about sort of the typical timing of reproductive events in angiosperms. So typically, floral primordia are initiated in the fall, and those primordia overwinter in buds and then emerge as flowers in the spring. And you know, we all think about the emergence of flowers in the spring, and then once those flowers are out, pollen is distributed and pollination occurs, and fertilization generally happens soon after, with fruit formation and ripening occurring that fall. So typically the reproductive cycle is completed within about a 12-month period. Now there are some species where this fruit formation and ripening may take a year, so that doesn't happen until the following fall. And in some species as well, there may be lags or gaps in these events that occur that also spread that reproductive timing out. And when we talk about pines in a minute, you'll see that happens in pines as well. But at any rate, this is the general pattern of reproductive timing for angiosperms.